Command had already sent the condolence letters. 3 copies, printed on official letterhead, each one expressing the Navy's deepest regrets for the loss of Petty Officer, First Class Jade Reeves, during a classified operation in hostile territory. Her mother received hers on a Tuesday morning, along with the folded flag and the promise that her daughter had died serving her country with honor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But then the security cameras caught something impossible. Grainy footage from a forward observation post showed a figure in torn fatigues dragging 2 bleeding Navy SEALs across 50 yards of open ground while enemy fire lit up the darkness around them. The timestamp read 0347 hours, 12 minutes after Jade Reeves was officially declared killed in action. The woman in the footage moved like a ghost, methodical and relentless, hauling 2 men twice her size to safety while rounds kicked up dust at her feet. When the base commander finally saw that footage 3 days later, his coffee mug shattered on the concrete floor of his office. Because the woman who was supposed to be dead had just saved 2 of the Navy's most elite warriors. And nobody could explain how. Want to know how a dead woman became a hero? And why the truth almost stayed buried forever? Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This is a story about courage that defied death itself. Let's begin. The forward operating base at Firebase Crimson sat like a scar on the landscape of Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. Concrete blast walls rose 20 feet high, crowned with razor wire that caught the morning sun like broken glass. The base hummed with the constant tension of war, generators grinding through another day, helicopters thundering overhead, and the distant crack of sniper fire from the surrounding mountains that never seemed to stop. October 15, 2019. Temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees by 800 hours, and the air tasted of dust, diesel fuel, and the metallic tang of ammunition that permeated everything in this corner of hell. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, a converted shipping container lined with monitors and communication equipment, Major David Hawthorne stared at a map covered in red pins. Each pin represented a known enemy position, and there were far too many of them for his liking. Hawthorne was a career Marine. 23 years of service that had taken him from the streets of Fallujah to the mountains of Afghanistan. His uniform was faded from too many deployments, and his hands bore the calluses of a man who'd spent more time holding weapons than pens. The lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent planning operations that would either save lives or cost them, with no guarantee which outcome awaited. "Sir, we've got movement on Sector 7, called out Sergeant Torres from his position at the surveillance station. Multiple monitors displayed feeds from cameras positioned around the base perimeter, each one scanning the rocky terrain for signs of enemy activity. Looks like a patrol, maybe 6 individuals, moving toward the southern approach." Hawthorne moved to Torres's shoulder, studying the grainy black and white footage. The figures moved with purpose, weapons visible, using the natural cover of boulders and dried creek beds to mask their approach. This was the 3rd probe in 2 days, enemy forces testing the base defenses, looking for weak points. "Alert status to yellow," Hawthorne ordered. "Get Lieutenant Commander Morrison on the horn. If they're planning something, I want to know about it before it happens." The base had been under increasing pressure for weeks. Intelligence reports suggested a major offensive was being planned, something bigger than the usual harassing attacks and random mortar fire. The enemy had been moving weapons and personnel into the area, staging for what military analysts believed would be coordinated assault on multiple positions simultaneously. In the communications bunker, radio operator First Class Kevin Walsh hunched over his equipment, monitoring multiple frequencies for any chatter that might give them advance warning. Static filled his headphones, punctuated by occasional bursts of coded transmissions that the intelligence team would later analyze for actionable information. Walsh had been doing this job for 4 years, long enough to develop an ear for the subtle changes in enemy communication patterns that preceded major operations. "Base, this is Overwatch 3, crackled a voice through the radio. "We've got visual on what looks like weapons movement, approximately 2 clicks northeast of your position. Multiple individuals carrying what appear to be RPGs and heavy equipment." Walsh keyed his microphone. "Copy, Overwatch 3. Can you get a count on personnel?" "Negative. Too much terrain interference, but this looks organized. Professional, not the usual local militia we've been dealing with." The intelligence was troubling, but not unexpected. For weeks, intercepted communications had suggested that foreign fighters were moving into the area, experienced combatants with training far beyond the local insurgents. These weren't farmers with rifles. These were soldiers who knew how to plan and execute complex operations out in the medical bay, a converted container that served as the base's primary treatment facility. Navy Hospital Corpsman Petty Officer First Class Jade Reeves checked her supplies for the 3rd time that morning. Medical kits lined metal shelves, each one carefully organized and ready for immediate deployment. Morphine, pressure bandages, emergency surgical equipment, everything needed to keep wounded warriors alive long enough to reach proper medical facilities. Jade was 26 years old. A compact woman with auburn hair pulled back in regulation style and green eyes that had seen too much combat for someone her age. She deployed to Afghanistan 8 months earlier, her 2nd combat deployment after serving with Marine units in Iraq. Her hands, small but strong, bore the faint scars of training and field medicine, each mark a testament to lives saved under impossible circumstances. The daughter of a nurse from small-town Oregon, Jade had enlisted after watching her mother work double shifts to support their family following her father's death in a construction accident. Military service offered structure, purpose, and the chance to serve something larger than herself. But it was the medical training that called to her, the opportunity to save lives instead of taking them. "Doc, you got a minute?" Lance Corporal Mike Brennan appeared in the doorway, his left arm wrapped in a field dressing. "Caught some shrapnel yesterday during the patrol. Probably should have come in sooner." Jade gestured him to the examination table, her movements efficient and professional. "Let's take a look. When did you clean it last?" "This morning. Use the antiseptic like you showed us." She unwrapped the dressing carefully, examining the wound with practiced eyes. 3 small fragments had penetrated the muscle, not deep enough to cause permanent damage, but requiring proper cleaning and antibiotic treatment to prevent infection. "You're lucky," she said, beginning to clean the area with antiseptic solution. "Few inches higher, and this could have hit something important. You need to be more careful about taking cover when you hear incoming." "Easy for you to say, Doc. You're not the one trying to return fire while diving behind rocks." Jade smiled grimly as she worked. "Trust me, I've been there. But dead heroes don't save anyone. Your job is to stay alive so you can complete the mission." As she worked, applying fresh dressings and preparing antibiotic injections, neither of them knew that within 6 hours, Jade would be declared dead. That her mother would receive a letter expressing the Navy's condolences for the ultimate sacrifice made in service to her country. That her personal effects would be gathered and prepared for shipment home. And neither of them could have imagined that, 12 minutes after her official time of death, security cameras would capture her dragging 2 wounded Navy SEALs to safety through enemy fire that should have killed anyone foolish enough to expose themselves in the open. The morning wore on, ordinary in every way except for the building tension that seemed to hang in the air like the heat itself. Equipment was checked and rechecked. Ammunition was distributed and counted. Medical supplies were inventoried one more time. By noon, Firebase Crimson was as ready as any forward operating base could be for whatever was coming. The only thing they couldn't prepare for was losing one of their own and discovering that death itself wasn't enough to stop a true warrior from completing the mission. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. How does a woman officially declared dead manage to save 2 elite Navy SEALs while enemy bullets are tearing apart everything around her? How do you explain security footage that shows the impossible? A ghost in combat fatigues performing a rescue that defied every law of war and survival. This isn't just another military story. This is about a moment when everything the brass thought they knew got turned upside down by 12 minutes of grainy footage that shouldn't exist. A moment when a mother's grief collided with evidence that her daughter was still fighting, still saving lives, still refusing to quit even when the entire military had written her off as another casualty of war. Hit that subscribe button right now if you want to hear stories about the warriors who don't make it into the official reports. The ones whose heroism happens in the shadows, far from medals and ceremonies. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, because this story belongs to everyone who's ever been underestimated, overlooked, or written off too soon. We're about to take you inside Firebase Crimson on the day everything changed. You'll see how split-second decisions made in chaos can ripple through command structures and shatter everything military leadership thought they understood about courage under fire. You'll discover why some acts of heroism are so extraordinary that they challenge the very definitions of what's humanly possible. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why Jade Reeves's mother received not 1, but 2 letters from the Navy, and why the second one changed everything she thought she knew about her daughter's final moments. This is the story of a rescue that wasn't supposed to happen, caught by cameras that weren't supposed to be recording, performed by a woman who wasn't supposed to be alive. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about courage, sacrifice, and the extraordinary things ordinary people can do when everything is on the line. Let's begin. The afternoon heat at Firebase Crimson was merciless, turning the concrete barriers into ovens that radiated waves of scorching air across the compound. By 1400 hours, the temperature gauge outside the Tactical Operations Center read 118 degrees Fahrenheit, and every piece of metal equipment was too hot to touch with bare hands. The mountains surrounding the base shimmered like mirages, their rocky peaks disappearing into a haze that made enemy observation nearly impossible, which worked both ways. Staff Sergeant Rachel Marino wiped sweat from her forehead as she supervised the afternoon equipment check in the armory. 27 years old, built like a marathon runner with the kind of wiry strength that came from years of hauling heavy gear across impossible terrain. Her dark hair was streaked with premature gray from too many deployments, and her brown eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen combat in 3 different countries. Torres, that M249 better be spotless when I inspect it, she called out to the young private who was field stripping the squad automatic weapon for the 3rd time that day. Enemy doesn't care if you're tired of cleaning your weapon. Marino had been Jade's closest friend on the base, the 2 women bonding over their shared experience of being among the few females in a predominantly male combat environment. They'd spent countless hours talking about home, about the families waiting for them, about the strange brotherhood that developed between warriors who depended on each other for survival. What Marino didn't know was that in less than 4 hours, she'd be the one to identify Jade's body, that she'd stand in the medical bay, looking down at her friend's face, and confirm for the record that Petty Officer First Class Jade Reeves was killed in action during Operation Nightfall. Across the base, in the communications bunker buried 6 feet underground, intelligence analyst second class Amy Chun studied satellite imagery on her computer screen. The photos taken by a classified surveillance satellite 3 hours earlier showed disturbing patterns of movement in the surrounding mountains. Vehicle tracks where no vehicle should be. Heat signatures that suggested large numbers of personnel staging in positions that overlooked Firebase. Crimson, Chung was a quiet woman in her early 30s. The daughter of Chinese immigrants who'd built a successful restaurant business in San Francisco. She joined the Navy to pay for college, intending to serve 4 years and get out. But 8 years later, she was still here, drawn by the intellectual challenge of piecing together enemy intentions from fragments of intercepted communications and satellite intelligence. Her computer pinged with an incoming encrypted message from Regional Command. Shun opened the file and felt her stomach drop. Intelligence sources confirmed that a major attack was planned for tonight, involving at least 60 enemy combatants with heavy weapons and explosives. The assault would begin 0330 hours with mortar fire, followed by coordinated attacks on multiple sides of the base perimeter. "Sir," Chung called to Lieutenant Commander Morrison, who was reviewing patrol schedules at a nearby desk. "We've got confirmation on tonight's attack. It's bigger than we thought." Morrison moved to her station, reading over her shoulder. He was a Naval Academy graduate, 10 years of service that had taken him from destroyers to riverine warfare to this landlocked assignment in the mountains of Afghanistan. His blonde hair was regulation short, his uniform crisp despite the heat, and he carried himself with the confidence of an officer who'd earned his rank through competence rather than politics. "How reliable is this intelligence?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. Sources this highly classified were usually accurate, which meant Firebase Crimson was about to face the largest assault since its establishment 18 months earlier. "Very reliable, sir. They're recommending we request immediate air support and consider evacuation of non-essential personnel." Morrison studied the satellite images, noting the terrain features that would provide cover for attacking forces. The base was positioned in a valley, necessary for helicopter landings and supply runs, but tactically disadvantageous when facing a determined enemy with the high ground. "Negative on the evacuation," he said finally. "We pull out now, we lose this entire sector. Get me Major Hawthorne on secure comms." In the base motor pool, Gunnery Sergeant Kyle Patterson supervised maintenance on the armored vehicles that would be crucial if the base came under attack. Patterson was a career Marine, 20 years of service in every hellhole the Corps had sent him to. His massive frame was covered in tattoos that told the story of deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, and half a dozen other places that didn't officially exist on military maps. "Johnson, that Bradley needs to be mission ready by 1800 hours. He barked at a young mechanic who was replacing the vehicle's track system. "I don't care if you have to work through chow time. Lives depend on that machine running when we need it." Patterson had served with Jade during her first deployment to Iraq, when she was fresh out of medical training and scared of everything. He'd watched her develop from a nervous kid into one of the most competent combat medics he'd ever worked with. She had that rare combination of technical skill and battlefield instinct that kept wounded warriors alive when everything was falling apart. What Patterson couldn't know was that by tomorrow morning, he'd be leading the search and recovery team that would find Jade's body in a bombed-out building 3 kilometers from the base, that he'd carry her remains back to Firebase Crimson, believing he was bringing home a fallen comrade for the last time. The late afternoon briefing in the Tactical Operations Center drew every senior enlisted leader and officer on the base. Major Hawthorne stood before a map of the local area, red pins marking confirmed enemy positions, blue pins showing friendly units. The ratio was sobering. They were outnumbered at least 3-1, fighting from a defensive position against an enemy that controlled the surrounding terrain. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we're going to earn our pay," Hawthorne began, his voice carrying the calm authority of a combat veteran. "Intelligence confirms coordinated assault beginning at 0330 hours. Mortar fire followed by ground assault from multiple directions. He pointed to specific positions on the map. Enemy will likely approach from the north and east, using the creek bed for cover. They'll try to breach the wire in at least 2 locations simultaneously, forcing us to divide our defensive fire. Staff Sergeant Marino raised her hand. Sir, what about close air support? 2 Apache helicopters on standby, but weather's moving in from the west. If we get the cloud cover that's predicted, air support becomes limited. Hawthorne's expression was grim. We may be on our own for the initial assault. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, covering fields of fire, ammunition distribution, and evacuation procedures for wounded personnel. Each leader received specific assignments, specific sectors to defend, specific responsibilities that could mean the difference between holding the base and being overrun. As the sun began to set behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across Firebase Crimson, the base settled into the tense quiet that preceded combat. Weapons were loaded and checked one final time. Ammunition was distributed to fighting positions. Medical supplies were prepared for the casualties that everyone knew were coming down in the medical bay. Jade completed her final preparations. Extra morphine in her field kit. Pressure bandages arranged for quick access. Emergency surgical equipment sterilized and ready for immediate use. She'd done this routine dozens of times before, but tonight felt different. The intelligence reports suggested this would be the biggest fight Firebase Crimson had ever faced. She pulled out her cell phone and typed a quick message to her mother. Everything fine here. Don't worry about the news reports. Love you. It was against regulations to send personal communications before an operation. But some rules mattered less than making sure the people you loved knew you were thinking about them. What Jade didn't know was that in 8 hours, that message would be the last communication her mother would ever receive from her daughter. That by dawn, the Navy would officially declare her killed in action. Another casualty in a war that seemed to consume everything it touched. As darkness fell over the mountains of Afghanistan, Firebase Crimson prepared for a battle that would test every skill, every friendship, every bond of trust that held the small military community together. The enemy was coming, and everyone knew that some of the people sharing tonight's watch would never see another sunrise, but none of them could have imagined that death itself would prove insufficient to stop one of their own from completing the mission. The first mortar round screamed overhead at exactly 0327 hours, 3 minutes ahead of the intelligence timeline. The explosion erupted 50 meters beyond the eastern perimeter, sending a column of dirt and debris 30 feet into the air. Before the echo finished bouncing off the surrounding mountains, the night sky lit up with incoming fire from positions that hadn't shown up on any surveillance report. Incoming! The warning cry echoed across Firebase Crimson as personnel dove for cover. The base's counter-battery radar immediately began tracking trajectory data, trying to pinpoint enemy mortar positions, but the attackers had learned from previous engagements. They were firing from multiple locations, displacing after each shot, making it nearly impossible to return effective fire. Major Hawthorne sprinted toward the tactical operations center as explosions walked across the compound in a methodical pattern. The enemy wasn't firing randomly, they were targeting specific structures. Communications, power generation, vehicle maintenance, medical facilities. Someone had studied Firebase Crimson's layout and identified exactly where to strike for maximum effect. Torres. Get me satellite comms to regional command. Hawthorne shouted over the noise of incoming rounds. Tell them we're under coordinated assault. Heavier than predicted. Radio operator Walsh was already working 3 different frequencies, trying to coordinate with air support units that were struggling with deteriorating weather conditions. Static filled his headphones as he adjusted antenna settings, fighting against atmospheric interference that seemed to worsen with each passing minute. Base. "This is Guardian Angel 7, crackled a voice through the static. "We're showing heavy cloud cover moving into your area. Visibility dropping to near zero. May not be able to provide close air support." The words hit Hawthorne like a physical blow. Without air support, Firebase Crimson would face the full weight of the enemy assault with only their defensive positions and whatever ammunition they had stockpiled. Against 60 attackers with heavy weapons. Those odds were sobering. In the eastern fighting position, Staff Sergeant Marino pressed herself against the concrete barrier as automatic weapons fire raked the position from multiple directions. The enemy had crept much closer than anyone expected, using the cover of darkness and intimate knowledge of the terrain to position themselves within effective range. "Contact front," she yelled into her radio. Multiple shooters, approximately 200 meters, using the creek bed for cover. "Request immediate support." But support was already stretched thin. Every defensive position was reporting contact simultaneously, exactly as the intelligence reports had predicted. The enemy had planned this assault meticulously, coordinating their approach to hit Firebase Crimson from 3 directions at once, forcing the defenders to spread their fire and dilute their effectiveness. Private Johnson, the young mechanic who'd been working on the Bradley fighting vehicle, found himself manning a machine gun position he'd only trained on twice. His hands shook as he loaded a fresh belt of ammunition, the metallic taste of fear filling his mouth. This wasn't training. Real bullets were snapping overhead. Real explosives were shaking the ground beneath his feet. "Steady, Johnson." Gunnery Sergeant Patterson's voice cut through the chaos. "Pick your targets. Make every round count." Patterson had seen this before, the moment when training either held or broke under the pressure of actual combat. Young soldiers either found their courage or froze, and there was no predicting which way it would go until the shooting started. The medical bay had become a chaos of preparation as Jade moved between supply stations, gathering everything she might need for battlefield treatment. The concrete walls vibrated with each explosion, dust falling from the ceiling as mortar rounds continued to impact around the compound. "Doc." Lance Corporal Brennan appeared in the doorway, his face pale in the emergency lighting. "Sergeant Torres took shrapnel in the communications bunker. Says he can still work, but he's bleeding pretty good." Jade grabbed her field medical kit and followed Brennan through corridors that seemed to shake with each incoming round. The communications bunker was filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burnt electronics. Torres sat at his radio position, blood running down his left arm from a gash that needed immediate attention. "Can't leave the radio," Torres insisted as Jade examined the wound. "We lose communications, we lose everything." She worked quickly, cleaning the wound and applying pressure bandages while Torres continued coordinating defensive fire. It was a scene that would repeat itself throughout the night, wounded personnel refusing to abandon their posts, choosing duty over personal safety. But the enemy had planned for this level of resistance. Intelligence reports that wouldn't be declassified for another decade revealed that the assault force included foreign advisors, experienced fighters who'd studied American defensive tactics and developed specific countermeasures. They knew how Americans fought, how they organized their defenses, how they responded to coordinated attacks. At 0415 hours, the character of the assault changed dramatically. The mortar fire, which had been systematic and methodical, suddenly intensified to a devastating barrage that targeted the base's northern perimeter. Explosions erupted in rapid succession, each one precisely placed to destroy defensive positions and create gaps in the wire barriers. "They're softening us up for the main assault," Lieutenant Commander Morrison observed, studying the pattern of incoming fire from the Tactical Operations Center. Classic textbook approach. Neutralize defenses, then send in the ground assault through the gaps. Intelligence analyst Chen monitored intercepted communications, her computer automatically translating fragments of enemy radio traffic What she heard made her blood run cold. "Sir, they're coordinating with units we didn't know were in the area," she reported. "I'm picking up at least 3 separate assault teams, plus what sounds like a reserve force waiting for our response." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just an assault on Firebase Crimson. It was a coordinated operation designed to draw American forces into a predetermined killing zone. The enemy had planned not just for the initial attack, but for the inevitable reinforcement attempts and helicopter evacuations that would follow. Outside, the darkness was split by muzzle flashes and the orange glow of explosions. Tracer rounds drew lines of light across the compound as defenders returned fire at targets they could barely see. The enemy had chosen their timing perfectly: new moon, overcast skies, and weather conditions that grounded most air support. In fighting position Alpha, Corporal Martinez called out target locations to his squad, trying to coordinate defensive fire against attackers who seemed to appear and disappear like ghosts in the darkness. Movement. 2 o'clock, approximately 150 meters, he reported. Multiple personnel advancing using bound and cover tactics. These weren't untrained insurgents charging blindly at American positions. These were professionals who understood small unit tactics, who moved with discipline and purpose, who had studied their target and planned their approach with military precision. The assault intensified as enemy forces reached the outer perimeter wire. Bangalore torpedoes, explosive charges designed to breach obstacles, detonated in coordinated sequence, creating multiple gaps that forced the defenders to spread their fire across too many targets. "Breach in Sector 2. Came the report over tactical radio. Enemy personnel advancing through the wire. Request immediate reinforcement. But reinforcements were already committed to defending other sectors. Every available person was manning a fighting position, treating wounded, or maintaining the communications that kept the defense coordinated. There were no reserves, no backup plan beyond holding each position until relief arrived or ammunition ran out. At 0438 hours, as the assault reached its peak intensity, a single mortar round impacted directly on the medical bay. The explosion collapsed part of the roof, filled the interior with smoke and debris, and created the chaos that would lead to the first of 2 official reports declaring Petty Officer First Class Jade Reeves killed in action. But what the official reports wouldn't mention, what the after-action reviews would miss entirely, was that Jade Reeves had left the medical bay 4 minutes before that mortar round hit. She'd grabbed her field kit and headed toward the sound of gunfire, responding to reports of wounded personnel who needed immediate evacuation. From an exposed fighting position, the woman who was about to be declared dead was actually running through enemy fire toward 2 wounded Navy SEALs who would have died without her. Intervention. 3 days after the battle, Captain Sarah Blackthorne sat in her air-conditioned office at Regional Command, methodically reviewing after-action reports from Firebase Crimson. As the senior intelligence officer for the sector, it was her responsibility to analyze what had gone wrong during the assault and identify lessons that could prevent similar casualties in future operations. The reports painted a clear picture of a well-coordinated enemy attack that had overwhelmed the bases, defenses through superior numbers and tactical planning. 14 American casualties, including 3 killed in action. Among the dead was Petty Officer First Class Jade Reeves, killed when a mortar round destroyed the medical bay where she was treating wounded personnel. Blackthorne had already signed off on the casualty reports and recommendations for posthumous commendations. The paperwork was complete, the families had been notified, and the investigation was essentially closed. She was only reviewing the surveillance footage as a routine administrative requirement, looking for tactical insights that might inform future defensive planning. The timestamp on the security camera footage read 0347 hours. October 16th, Camera 7, positioned on the northeastern observation tower, had maintained power throughout the assault despite multiple hits to the base's electrical systems. The footage was grainy, shot in infrared to penetrate the darkness, but clear enough to make out individual figures moving across the compound. Blackthorn fast-forwarded through the initial minutes of the assault, watching mortar rounds impact in bright flashes on the black and white display. She could see defensive positions returning fire, personnel moving between cover points. The organized chaos of a military unit under attack. At 0343 hours, she slowed the playback to normal speed. This was the time frame when the medical bay had been hit, when Jade Reeves had officially been killed in action. Blackthorn wanted to see if the footage captured any details about the mortar strike that might inform future defensive planning. What she saw instead made her stop breathing. Figure in combat fatigues was moving across the compound's eastern sector, carrying what appeared to be a medical kit. The person moved with purpose despite enemy fire that was kicking up dust all around them. At 0344 hours, the figure reached a damaged fighting position where two larger shapes lay motionless in the rubble. Blackthorn leaned closer to her monitor, adjusting the brightness and contrast to get a clearer image. The figure knelt beside the two prone forms, and she could see the distinctive motions of someone performing battlefield medical treatment, checking for vital signs, applying pressure to wounds, preparing casualties for evacuation. At 0345 hours, enemy fire intensified around the position. Automatic weapons fire swept across the area, and what looked like an RPG round impacted just 20 meters away. Any rational person would have taken cover, abandoned the exposed position, sought safety in the nearest bunker. Instead, the figure began dragging one of the wounded toward cover. The first casualty was massive, easily twice the size of the rescuer. But the figure managed to get the unconscious man onto their back and began moving toward the base's central compound. Every few steps, they would drop to one knee as enemy fire got too close, then resume the agonizingly slow journey to safety. Blackthorn checked the timestamp again. 346 hours. According to the casualty reports, Jade Reeves had been killed at 0343 when the medical bay took a direct hit. But the time frame didn't match what she was seeing on the security footage. The figure on the screen reached cover behind a concrete barrier and set down the first casualty. Without pausing to rest, they immediately headed back toward the damaged fighting position where the second wounded person remained. Enemy fire was still raking the area, muzzle flashes visible in the darkness beyond the perimeter. At 0347 hours, the figure reached the second casualty and began the same process. Medical evaluation, emergency treatment, preparation for evacuation. This second person appeared to be unconscious but breathing, their body limp as the rescuer positioned them for transport. The journey back was even more harrowing. Enemy forces had adjusted their fire, concentrating on the area where they'd seen movement. Rounds impacted all around the slow-moving pair, some passing close enough to tear pieces of fabric from the rescuer's uniform, but the figure never stopped, never took cover, never abandoned their casualty. Step by agonizing step, they hauled the wounded person across 50 meters of open ground while enemy fire tried to cut them down. Blackthorn realized she was holding her breath as she watched the drama unfold on her screen. At 0348 hours, the rescuer reached safety behind the same concrete barrier where they'd left the first casualty. Both wounded personnel were now in cover, receiving medical treatment from someone who was officially supposed to be dead. She rewound the footage and played it again, this time focusing on details she'd missed during the first viewing. The rescuers' movement patterns, their size and build, the way they handled the medical equipment. Everything about the figure suggested extensive combat, medical training, and experience in battlefield conditions. But according to every official report, the only person at Firebase Crimson with that level of medical expertise was Jade Reeves. and Jade Reeves had been killed when the medical bay was destroyed at 0343 hours. Blackthorn pulled up the personnel files for Firebase Crimson, cross-referencing medical training records with physical descriptions. Only 3 people on the base had the qualifications to perform the kind of battlefield medicine she'd witnessed on the security footage. 2 were male, significantly larger than the figure in the video. The third was Petty Officer First Class Jade Reeves. She enhanced the footage using image analysis software to extract every possible detail from the grainy infrared recording. The rescuer's height, build, and movement patterns all matched Jade's physical profile. More importantly, the medical procedures being performed were consistent with Navy combat medic training, using techniques that weren't widely known outside of military medical programs. At 0349 hours, the footage showed the rescuer checking both casualties one final time before moving toward the base's communication bunker. They disappeared from Camera 7's field of view, but Blackthorn immediately pulled up footage from other security cameras to track their movement. Camera 12, positioned near the communications facility, picked up the figure at 0350 hours. They were moving more slowly now, and Blackthorn could see dark stains on their uniform that suggested they'd been wounded during the rescue. But they were still mobile, still mission-focused, still alive. The figure reached the communications bunker and disappeared inside. Camera 12 continued recording for another 17 minutes before an enemy mortar round destroyed the camera position. Ending the surveillance record, Blackthorn sat back in her chair, staring at the frozen image on her screen. The implications of what she'd witnessed were staggering. Either the casualty reports were wrong, or someone who was supposed to be dead had performed one of the most heroic rescues she'd ever seen captured on film. She pulled up the personnel files for the 2 casualties who'd been rescued. Both were Navy SEALs, members of an elite unit that had been conducting classified operations in the area. Petty Officer Marcus Thompson and Petty Officer James Mitchell, both critically wounded during the assault, but listed as recovered and evacuated. Their medical treatment records showed they'd received field medical care that had stabilized their conditions long enough for helicopter evacuation. The treating physician had noted that whoever performed the initial battlefield treatment had undoubtedly saved both men's lives through expert medical intervention under extreme conditions. But according to the official records, no one had been available to provide that treatment. The base's medical personnel had been killed or pinned down by enemy fire. The rescue that had saved 2 elite warriors wasn't supposed to have happened. Blackthorn reached for her secure phone to contact the commanding officer at Firebase Crimson. Someone needed to explain how a dead woman had managed to drag 2 wounded SEALs to safety while enemy fire was trying to kill everyone in sight. As she dialed the number, she realized that everything the military thought it knew about the assault on Firebase Crimson was about to change. The security footage she'd just reviewed would force a complete re-examination of the casualty reports, the timeline of events, and the heroism that had been overlooked in the chaos of battle. Most importantly, it would mean that somewhere, a mother who'd been grieving her daughter's death was about to learn that the official reports had been wrong, that her daughter had not only survived the initial assault, but had risked everything to save 2 fellow warriors who would have died without her intervention. The phone rang once before. Major Hawthorne's voice answered. Firebase Crimson, Major Hawthorne speaking. Major, this is Captain Blackthorn at Regional Command. I need to ask you about your casualty reports from October 16th. Specifically, about Petty Officer Jade Reeves. Major Hawthorne set down his satellite phone with hands that trembled slightly, a reaction he hadn't experienced since his first firefight 20 years earlier. The conversation with Captain Blackthorn had lasted exactly 11 minutes, but those 11 minutes had shattered everything he thought he knew about the assault on Firebase Crimson. Sergeant Marino, report to my office immediately, he spoke into his radio. His voice carefully controlled, despite the chaos building in his mind. Bring the casualty documentation from October 16th, all of it. Firebase Crimson was still rebuilding from the assault. Construction crews worked around the clock to repair damaged facilities, while investigators from multiple agencies collected evidence and interviewed personnel. The base hummed with activity. But underneath the noise of reconstruction was a tension that hadn't existed before the attack, the knowledge that they'd survived something that should have destroyed them. Staff Sergeant Marino arrived within minutes, carrying a thick folder of casualty reports, medical documentation, and witness statements. Her face still bore the pale complexion of someone processing trauma, and her left hand was bandaged from shrapnel wounds received during the fighting. "Sir, you requested the casualty files?" She placed the folder on Hawthorne's desk, noting the unusual tension in his expression. In 18 months of serving under the Major, she'd never seen him look quite so unsettled. "Rachel, I need you to walk me through exactly what happened with Jade Reeves. Every detail you can remember, starting from 0330 hours on October 16th. Marino's face tightened at the mention of her friend's name. She'd been the one to identify Jade's body, the one to confirm for the official record that Petty Officer First Class Jade Reeves had been killed in action. The memory still woke her up at night, the image of her friend's lifeless form in the rubble of the destroyed medical bay. "Sir, we've been through this multiple times with the investigators. Jade was in the medical bay when the mortar round hit at 0343 hours. I found her body approximately 40 minutes later when we were able to clear the debris. She died instantly." Hawthorne opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs taken during the aftermath of the assault. Images of the destroyed medical bay, the recovery of casualties, the methodical documentation that followed every military engagement. He studied them for a moment before looking back at Marino. "Rachel, I need you to be absolutely certain about the timeline. When was the last time you actually saw Jade alive?" The question hit Marino like a physical blow. She'd answered it dozens of times for various investigators, but something in Hawthorne's tone suggested this wasn't routine follow-up questioning. "Sir, approximately 0340 hours. She was preparing medical supplies for battlefield treatment. Said she was going to move forward to assist with casualties in the fighting positions." Marino paused, trying to recall exact details. "She grabbed her field kit and headed toward the eastern perimeter. That was the last time I saw her alive." Hawthorne made notes on a legal pad, his handwriting precise despite the tremor in his hands. "And when you found her body in the medical bay, what was her condition?" "Killed by blast trauma, sir. The mortar round had collapsed that section of the building. She was buried under approximately 2 feet of concrete and debris. Was she wearing her field medical kit when you found her?" The question stopped Marino cold. She'd never been asked that specific detail before, and as she thought about it, she realized something that made her stomach drop. "No, sir. She wasn't wearing her medical kit when we recovered her body." Hawthorne set down his pen and looked directly at her. "Rachel, I'm about to share some information that's going to be difficult to process. Regional Command has reviewed security footage from the assault. Footage that shows someone matching Jade's description performing a medical rescue at 0347 hours, 4 minutes after she was officially declared killed in action." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from an explosion. Marino stared at her commanding officer, trying to process information that challenged everything she thought she knew about her friend's death. "Sir, that's not possible. I identified her body myself. I saw her injuries, confirmed her identity for the official record." "I know you did. And I'm not questioning your identification or your professionalism. But I need you to consider the possibility that there were 2 separate incidents involving Jade Reeves. One in which she left the medical bay to assist wounded personnel, and another in which someone else was killed when the medical bay was destroyed." Hawthorne pulled out enhanced photographs from the security footage, images that had been processed by intelligence analysts to extract maximum detail from the grainy infrared recording. The figure in the photos was clearly performing medical procedures on 2 casualties, using techniques consistent with Navy combat medic training. The person in this footage has Jade's physical profile, her medical training, and her equipment. According to the timestamps, this rescue took place at 0347 hours. But according to our casualty reports, Jade was already dead. Marino studied the photographs, her mind racing through the implications. If Jade had been alive at 0347 hours, performing a rescue that had saved 2 Navy SEALs, then everything about the official casualty reports needed to be re-examined. Sir, who was killed in the medical bay if it wasn't Jade? That's what we need to determine. I've already contacted the base mortuary affairs officer. We need to re-examine the remains that were identified as Jade Reeves, conduct DNA analysis, and cross-reference with any other personnel who might have been in the medical bay at the time of the strike. The implications were staggering. If the identification had been wrong, it meant that Jade's mother had been grieving a death that hadn't occurred. It meant that casualty notifications had been sent based on incorrect information. It meant that the most heroic action of the entire assault, the rescue of 2 elite warriors under enemy fire, had been performed by someone who was officially dead. Hawthorne picked up his phone and dialed the number for Regional Command's medical examiner. Dr. Patterson, this is Major Hawthorne at Firebase Crimson. I need to request immediate DNA analysis on casualty serial number FB101603, identified as Petty Officer Jade Reeves. Priority classification is urgent. While he spoke, Marino continued studying the security footage photographs. The more she looked at them, the more convinced she became that the figure in the images was indeed her friend. The posture, the way they moved, the methodical approach to medical treatment, everything matched Jade's professional behavior under stress. Sir, she said after Hawthorne finished his call, if Jade was alive during the rescue, what happened to her after 0350 hours? The security footage shows her entering the communications bunker, but we never found any trace of her there. That's the next phase of the investigation. I've ordered a complete search of the communications facility and the surrounding area. If Jade survived the initial assault and performed this rescue, we need to determine her final disposition. The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Hawthorne answered on the first ring. Major Hawthorne speaking. Sir, this is Chief Petty Officer Thompson at Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth. I understand you're investigating casualty reports from Firebase Crimson? Thompson was one of the Navy SEALs who'd been evacuated after the assault, one of the 2 men who'd been rescued by the mysterious figure in the security footage. His call wasn't coincidental. Word was already spreading through military, medical channels about the discrepancies in the casualty reports. Chief Thompson, yes. I need to ask you about the medical treatment you received during the assault. Specifically, who provided your initial battlefield care? Sir, that's why I'm calling. I've been following the reports about Petty Officer Reeves being killed in action, and something doesn't add up. The person who treated me in Mitchell was definitely a woman, definitely Navy medical training, and definitely knew what she was doing. She saved our lives. Hawthorne exchanged glances with Marino. Chief, can you describe this person? Small, maybe 5'4", auburn hair, green eyes. Spoke with a slight Oregon accent. Called me by my first name when she was working on my wounds. Told me I was going to be fine, that she was going to get me out of there. The description matched Jade Reeves perfectly. More importantly, Thompson was describing personal details that couldn't be gleaned from personnel files or casualty reports. He was describing someone he'd interacted with personally. Someone who'd treated his wounds and reassured him during the worst moments of his life. Chief, according to our timeline, You received this treatment at approximately 0347 hours on October 16th. Is that consistent with your recollection? Yes, sir. Just after the heavy mortar barrage ended. We'd been hit pretty bad, thought we were done for. Then this woman appeared out of nowhere, started working on us like bullets went flying all around. Most courage I've ever seen displayed by anyone, sir. She earned whatever commendation you're planning to give her. Hawthorne realized that Thompson didn't know about the discrepancies in the casualty reports. Didn't know that the woman who'd saved his life was officially listed as killed in action 4 minutes before she'd reached his position. Chief, I'll need you to provide a detailed statement about your interaction with Petty Officer Reeves. Can you be available for a formal interview within the next 24 hours? Absolutely, sir. Whatever you need. That woman deserves recognition for what she did. After ending the call, Hawthorne sat back in his chair and tried to process the mounting evidence. Security footage showing a rescue that officially never happened. Eyewitness testimony from the person who'd been rescued. Physical evidence that didn't match the casualty reports. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. Jade Reeves had not only survived the initial assault on Firebase Crimson, but had performed one of the most heroic actions in the base's history. And somehow, that heroism had been overlooked, misreported, and nearly lost to history. Rachel, he said finally, we need to prepare for the possibility that we're about to rewrite everything we thought we knew about October 16th, and we need to prepare for the possibility that we're going to have to tell a mother that her daughter was actually a hero. Admiral Patricia Kellerman had commanded naval operations in 3 different theaters of war, but she'd never received a briefing quite like the one that landed on her desk at 0600 hours on October 22nd. The folder marked Urgent Casualty Review, Firebase Crimson, contained evidence that would force the Navy to confront one of the most significant administrative failures in recent military history. The DNA analysis results were conclusive and devastating. The remains that had been identified as Petty Officer First Class Jade Reeves actually belonged to Hospital Corpsman Third Class Lisa Chun, a reservist who'd been temporarily assigned to Firebase Crimson for medical support duties. Chun had been in the medical bay when the mortar round struck, and in the chaos following the explosion, her identification tags had been destroyed along with most of her personal effects. Kellerman studied the forensic report with the methodical precision that had earned her 3 stars and the respect of every officer who'd served under her command. The evidence was overwhelming. Jade Reeves had not died in the medical bay explosion. She had survived, performed a heroic rescue of 2 Navy SEALs, and then disappeared into circumstances that remained unclear. Captain Rodriguez, Kellerman spoke into her intercom, summoning her chief of staff. I need you to arrange an immediate secure conference call with the Chief of Naval Operations. Priority Alpha classification. Within 30 minutes. Kellerman found herself explaining the situation to Admiral James Morrison, the highest-ranking officer in the United States Navy. The conversation took place over encrypted satellite communications. But even through the digital processing, she could hear the disbelief in Morrison's voice. Admiral, are you telling me that we notified a family of their daughter's death, conducted memorial services, and processed casualty benefits based on misidentified remains? Yes, sir. DNA analysis confirms that the casualty we identified as Petty Officer Reeves was actually Hospital Corpsman Chen. Security footage and witness testimony confirmed that Reeves was alive and performing medical duties at least 4 minutes after her official time of death. The silence on the other end of the connection stretched for nearly 15 seconds before Morrison responded. What's the current status of Petty Officer Reeves? Unknown, sir. The last confirmed sighting was security footage showing her entering the communications Bunker at Firebase Crimson at 0350 hours. The facility was subsequently destroyed by enemy fire, but no additional remains have been recovered from that location. Morrison's voice took on the tone of an officer who'd spent 30 years making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Admiral, I'm authorizing a complete investigation with unlimited resources. I want every piece of evidence re-examined, every witness re-interviewed, and every possibility explored. If Petty Officer Reeves is alive, we find her. If she's dead, we determine the exact circumstances and ensure she receives appropriate recognition. Understood, sir. I'll coordinate with Special Operations Command to establish a joint task force. Admiral, there's something else. Based on the preliminary reports, it appears that Petty Officer Reeves performed actions during this engagement that meet the criteria for the Medal of Honor, rescuing 2 fellow service members under enemy fire, at great personal risk with complete disregard for her own safety. If the investigation confirms these facts, I want a recommendation package prepared immediately. The words Sir, she said after Hawthorne finished his call, if Jade was alive during the rescue, what happened to her after 0350 hours? The security footage shows her entering the communications bunker, but we never found any trace of her there. That's the next phase of the investigation. I've ordered a complete search of the communications facility and the surrounding area. If Jade survived the initial assault and performed this rescue, we need to determine her final disposition. The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Hawthorne answered on the first ring. Major Hawthorne speaking. Sir, this is Chief Petty Officer Thompson at Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth. I understand you're investigating casualty reports from Firebase Crimson? Thompson was one of the Navy SEALs who'd been evacuated after the assault, one of the 2 men who'd been rescued by the mysterious figure in the security footage. His call wasn't coincidental. Word was already spreading through military, medical channels about the discrepancies in the casualty reports. Chief Thompson, yes. I need to ask you about the medical treatment you received during the assault. Specifically, who provided your initial battlefield care? Sir, that's why I'm calling. I've been following the reports about Petty Officer Reeves being killed in action, and something doesn't add up. The person who treated me and Mitchell was definitely a woman, definitely Navy medical training, and definitely knew what she was doing. She saved our lives. Hawthorne exchanged glances with Marino. Chief, can you describe this person? Small, maybe 5'4", auburn hair, green eyes. Spoke with a slight Oregon accent. Called me by my first name when she was working on my wounds. Told me I was going to be fine, that she was going to get me out of there. The description matched Jade Reeves perfectly. More importantly, Thompson was describing personal details that couldn't be gleaned from personnel files or casualty reports. He was describing someone he'd interacted with personally. Someone who'd treated his wounds and reassured him during the worst moments of his life. Chief, according to our timeline, you received this treatment at approximately 0347 hours on October 16th. Is that consistent with your recollection? Yes, sir. If anyone finds this, tell my mother I was doing my job. Thompson and Mitchell are stable and evacuated. Enemy breakthrough expected from the north. Moving to defensive position, Charlie 7 to provide medical support. Tell command that Lisa Chun died in the medical bay, not me. She deserves recognition too. PO1 J Reeves, 0352 hours, 16 OCT 2019. Santos read the note 3 times before fully processing its implications. Jade Reeves had not only survived the rescue of the 2 SEALs, but had correctly identified the misidentification of remains and had moved to another defensive position to continue providing medical support. Get this to Major Hawthorne immediately, Santos ordered. And contact Regional Command. We need search teams at defensive position Charlie 7. The note provided crucial intelligence that had been missing from the investigation. Jade had recognized that her death had been misreported, but instead of seeking safety or attempting to correct the record, she had continued her medical duties. Even believing that her family thought she was dead, she had chosen to remain at her post and continue serving wounded personnel. Position Charlie 7 was located approximately 400 meters northwest of the communications bunker, a reinforced position that had been overrun during the final phase of the enemy assault. The position had been searched immediately after the battle, but investigators had been looking for enemy casualties and intelligence materials. Not missing American personnel, the new search began at 1600 hours, with teams from multiple agencies converging on the position. Ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly beneath a collapsed section of the defensive works, suggesting the presence of a void space that might have provided protection during the bombardment. At 1847 hours, exactly 7 days after the assault on Firebase Crimson began, search teams made contact with a faint sound coming from beneath the collapsed bunker. Tapping, rhythmic, deliberate tapping that followed the pattern of Morse code. The message was simple but unmistakable. Jade lave nedicl. The rescue operation that followed mobilized every available resource at Firebase Crimson. Engineering equipment worked to carefully remove debris while medical teams prepared for emergency treatment. The void space that had protected Jade was small, barely large enough for one person, and access was limited to a narrow opening that required specialized extraction techniques. At 2134 hours, 7 days, 18 hours and 4 minutes after she'd been officially declared killed in action, Petty Officer First Class Jade Reeves was pulled from the rubble of defensive position Charlie 7. She was alive, conscious, and asking about the condition of the two SEALs she'd rescued. Her first words to the medical team were typical of her character. "Did Thompson and Mitchell make it home okay?" The news spread through Firebase Crimson like wildfire, then traveled up the chain of command with unprecedented speed. Within 2 hours, Admiral Morrison had been personally briefed on Jade's rescue. Within 4 hours, her mother received a phone call that began with the words, "Mrs. Reeves, this is Admiral Patricia Kellerman. I'm calling to inform you that your daughter is alive." The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, as Kellerman personally apologized for the error, explained the circumstances that had led to the misidentification, and described the heroic actions that had saved 2 fellow service members. She concluded with a promise that would reshape how the Navy recognized extraordinary valor. "Mrs. Reeves, your daughter's actions during the assault on Firebase Crimson represent the highest traditions of naval service. I want you to know that she's being recommended for the Medal of Honor, and that her courage has already saved lives and inspired everyone who's heard her story." As medical teams worked to treat Jade's injuries, dehydration, a concussion, and several broken ribs from the bunker collapse, investigators began the process of documenting actions that would make her one of the most decorated female service members in Navy history. The woman who'd been declared dead had not only survived against impossible odds, but had demonstrated the kind of valor that defined the very best of American military service. 6 weeks after her rescue from the collapsed bunker, Jade Reeves stood before the assembled personnel of Firebase Crimson in the reconstructed medical bay. Her left arm remained in a sling from injuries sustained during the bunker collapse, and her face still bore the faint marks of her ordeal. But her green eyes held the same steady determination that had driven her to risk everything. For 2 wounded SEALs, the medical bay had been rebuilt with improved blast-resistant construction and expanded capacity, a direct result of lessons learned during the October assault. But more importantly, it had been renamed the Lisa Chun Memorial Medical Center, honoring the young hospital corpsman whose death had been misattributed to Jade for 7 agonizing days. "Ladies and gentlemen," Major Hawthorne addressed the crowd of soldiers, sailors, and medical personnel who'd gathered for the ceremony. Today we recognize not just extraordinary valor, but the kind of leadership that inspires others to exceed their own limitations. The crowd included Chief Petty Officer Thompson and Petty Officer Mitchell, the two Navy SEALs whose lives Jade had saved during the assault. Both men had recovered fully from their injuries and had specifically requested permission to attend the ceremony. Thompson still walked with a slight limp from the leg wound Jade had treated under enemy fire, but he'd insisted on standing throughout the ceremony rather than accepting the offered chair. Before we proceed with the official recognition, Hawthorne continued, Petty Officer Reeves has requested the opportunity to demonstrate the medical training protocols that proved so effective during the assault. She believes that sharing these techniques could save lives in future engagements. What followed was unlike any military ceremony the base had ever witnessed. Instead of simply receiving recognition for past actions, Jade began teaching the assembled personnel the advanced battlefield medical techniques she'd employed during the rescue. Her voice was clear and professional as she explained the principles of combat medicine that had stabilized Thompson and Mitchell's conditions long enough for helicopter evacuation. The key to battlefield medical care isn't just technical knowledge, she explained, using a training mannequin to demonstrate proper tourniquet application. It's maintaining focus under extreme stress. When bullets are impacting around you, when the patient is screaming, when everything in your brain is telling you to seek cover, that's when training takes over. She moved through a series of demonstrations with the fluid competence that had impressed her instructors throughout her military career. Pressure point control for arterial bleeding, emergency airway management, shock treatment using limited field supplies. Each technique was explained with the clarity of someone who'd applied these skills in actual combat conditions. Sergeant Morrison, would you assist me with this demonstration? Jade asked, selecting a young soldier from the audience. Morrison approached nervously, clearly intimidated by the attention. Relax, Jade said with a slight smile. This is much easier than doing it while people are shooting at you. She guided Morrison through the process of applying the chest seal to treat a sucking chest wound, one of the injuries she'd treated on Mitchell during the rescue. Her instruction was patient but precise, correcting his technique while explaining the physiological principles behind each step. The goal isn't perfection, she told the audience as Morrison completed the procedure. The goal is good enough to keep someone alive until they can reach definitive medical care. Sometimes good enough means the difference between a fallen comrade and a recovery success story. The training session continued for over an hour, with Jade demonstrating techniques that weren't typically taught to non-medical personnel. Advanced medication administration, field surgical procedures, emergency communication protocols for medical evacuations. She shared knowledge that had been earned through years of training and refined under the worst possible conditions. "Ma'am," asked Corporal Davis, a young Marine who'd been wounded during the assault, "how do you maintain focus when everything's chaos? When you're scared and exhausted and people are depending on you?" Jade paused, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "You remember that fear is normal. Exhaustion is normal. What's not normal is giving up. The people around you, your teammates, your patients, your unit, they become more important than your own safety. That's not heroism, that's just doing the job you signed up for." The simplicity of her answer impressed the audience more than any elaborate speech could have. Here was someone who demonstrated extraordinary courage under fire, and she spoke about it as simply doing her duty. The contrast between her actions and her humble explanation highlighted the character that had driven her to risk everything for two wounded SEALs. Admiral Kellerman, who'd flown in specifically for the ceremony, watched the training session with the appreciation of an officer who understood the difference between theoretical knowledge and proven competence. She'd reviewed the video footage of Jade's rescue dozens of times, studying the tactical decisions and medical procedures that had succeeded under impossible conditions. "Petty Officer Reeves," Kellerman said as the training session concluded, "your demonstration today proves what we learned from the security footage. You didn't just save 2 lives through courage. You saved them through superior competence applied under extreme pressure." The formal ceremony that followed was deliberately simple. No bands, no elaborate speeches, no political officials seeking photo opportunities. Just the recognition of exceptional performance by people who understood what that performance had cost. Petty Officer First Class Jade Reeves, Admiral Kellerman, read from the official citation. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, while serving as a hospital corpsman during combat operations against enemy forces at Firebase Crimson, Afghanistan." The citation continued with specific details of Jade's actions: the rescue of 2 critically wounded personnel under enemy fire, the expert medical treatment that stabilized their conditions, and the decision to continue serving at her post. Despite being officially declared killed in action, her extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty reflected great credit upon herself, and were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. As Kellerman presented the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, the assembled personnel stood in silent recognition of actions that had redefined their understanding of courage under fire. But perhaps more impressive than the medal itself was what happened next. Chief Thompson stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the reconstructed medical bay. "Ma'am, with your permission, I'd like to say something." Kellerman nodded, and Thompson turned to address Jade directly. "Doc, when you pulled Mitchell and me out of that fighting position, you didn't know our names, didn't know our ranks, didn't know anything about us except that we needed help. You just saw 2 wounded Americans and decided they were worth risking your life for." His voice strengthened as he continued. "That's what service looks like. That's what honor looks like. And that's what the rest of us aspire to when we put on this uniform." Mitchell joined Thompson, adding his own testimony about the medical care that had saved his life. Other personnel began sharing their own observations about Jade's character, her competence, and her dedication throughout her deployment. What emerged was a picture of someone who'd consistently demonstrated the values that the military claimed to represent. The ceremony concluded with Jade being promoted to Chief Petty Officer, recognizing not just her heroic actions, but her proven leadership capabilities. More importantly, she was assigned as the senior medical instructor for the entire regional command, a position that would allow her to train hundreds of personnel in the advanced battlefield medical techniques she'd demonstrated. As the crowd dispersed, Jade remained in the medical bay, checking equipment and organizing supplies with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her work throughout the deployment. For her, the recognition was appreciated, but secondary to the mission of keeping personnel alive and healthy. Admiral Kellerman approached as Jade completed her equipment check. "Chief Reeves, you've proven that extraordinary actions emerge from ordinary dedication to excellence. The Navy is better because of your service." Jade's response was characteristically direct. "Thank you, ma'am. But the real test isn't what happened during one night of combat. The real test is whether we learn from it and use that knowledge to serve better tomorrow." The woman who'd been written off as a casualty had not only survived against impossible odds, but had demonstrated the kind of competence and character that would influence military medical training for years to come. Her actions had validated every assumption about her worthiness for recognition, proving that heroism wasn't just about courage in a moment of crisis, but about sustained excellence in service to others. 2 years later, Chief Petty Officer Jade Reeves stood before a packed auditorium at the Naval Medical Center in Portsmouth, Virginia, addressing the largest gathering of military medical personnel in the facility's history. The audience included doctors, nurses, corpsmen, and medics from all branches of the military, each drawn by the opportunity to learn from someone whose actions had redefined their understanding of battlefield medicine. But this wasn't just another medical conference. The people filling every seat, standing along the walls, and listening from the overflow rooms represented something deeper, a recognition that extraordinary capability often exists in ordinary places, waiting for the right moment to emerge. 3 years ago, Jade began, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the auditorium. I was a second-class petty officer doing routine medical support at a forward operating base. Nobody would have described me as special, exceptional, or heroic. I was just someone who'd learned to do my job well and took that responsibility seriously. The audience listened with the focused attention that medical professionals reserve for life-saving information. But they were hearing something more valuable than technical procedures. They were learning about the mindset that transforms ordinary people into extraordinary performers when everything depends on their actions. The night Firebase Crimson was attacked, I didn't wake up planning to perform any heroic acts. I woke up planning to do my job, which was keeping wounded personnel alive. When the shooting started, I didn't think about medals or recognition or how my actions might be remembered. I thought about Thompson and Mitchell bleeding out in a fighting position. And I thought about how I had the skills to prevent that from happening. The simplicity of her explanation resonated throughout the auditorium. Here was someone who'd received the nation's highest military decoration, speaking about her actions as matter-of-factly as discussing routine medical procedures. What I learned that night wasn't about courage under fire, though that's how the story gets told. What I learned was that years of preparation and training create the foundation for split-second decisions. When Thompson needed a tourniquet applied in 30 seconds, or he'd bleed to death, I didn't have time to be afraid. I had muscle memory, technical knowledge, and the absolute certainty that I could save his life. Dr. Amanda Foster, the Navy's Surgeon General, watched from the front row with the appreciation of someone who understood the difference between theoretical medicine and battlefield application. She'd reviewed every detail of Jade's actions during the Firebase Crimson assault, studying the medical decisions that had kept 2 critically wounded SEALs alive long enough for helicopter evacuation. The real lesson from that night, Jade continued, isn't about what one person can accomplish under extreme circumstances. It's about what every person in this auditorium is capable of when they combine technical excellence with unwavering commitment to the people depending on them. She moved away from the podium, walking closer to the audience with the same confident ease she'd demonstrated during combat operations. How many of you have been in situations where someone's life depended on your decisions, where there was no time for consultation, no opportunity for second opinions, no backup plan if you made the wrong choice? Hands rose throughout the auditorium, dozens, then hundreds, as medical personnel acknowledged their own moments of critical responsibility. Every one of you has faced that moment when everything comes down to your training, your judgment, and your willingness to act decisively despite uncertainty. That's not unique to combat medicine. That's the reality of serving others when the stakes are highest. The presentation continued with technical details about the medical procedures Jade had employed during the rescue. But woven throughout was a deeper message about the psychology of performance under pressure. She spoke about the importance of preparation, the value of repetitive training, and the mindset required to function effectively when failure meant the loss of human life. Excellence isn't an accident, she explained, demonstrating the tourniquet application that had controlled Thompson's arterial bleeding. It's the result of deliberate practice repeated until correct action becomes automatic. When you're working on a trauma patient and everything's chaos around you, you don't rise to the occasion, you default to your level of preparation. The audience included Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, a young medical officer who'd graduated from medical school just 18 months earlier. Like many in attendance, Martinez had initially been drawn by the opportunity to learn from a Medal of Honor recipient. But as she listened to Jade speak, she realized she was learning something more fundamental about professional responsibility and personal character. "Ma'am," Martinez asked during the question period, "how do you maintain that level of preparation when you're not in combat? How do you stay ready for situations you hope never happen?" Jade's answer revealed the philosophy that had guided her throughout her military career. "You remember that readiness isn't about you. It's about the people who will depend on you when everything goes wrong. Every time you practice a medical procedure, every time you review emergency protocols, every time you push yourself to be better than yesterday, you're preparing to serve someone who will need your absolute best effort." The response drew sustained applause from an audience that recognized the truth in her words. Medical professionals understood the weight of responsibility that came with their knowledge and skills. But hearing it articulated with such clarity reinforced their commitment to continuous improvement. As the presentation concluded, Admiral Morrison took the stage to address the broader implications of Jade's story. Chief Reeves represents something that every military leader hopes to see in their personnel: a combination of technical competence, moral courage, and selfless dedication that defines the finest traditions of military service. He turned to address Jade directly. "Your actions during the assault on Firebase Crimson demonstrated that heroism isn't about seeking glory or recognition. It's about doing what's right when doing what's right is difficult, dangerous, and unrecognized." The ceremony concluded with the announcement that the Navy's Advanced Combat Medical Training Program would be renamed the Jade Reeves Institute for Battlefield Medicine, ensuring that her techniques and philosophy would influence military medical training for generations to come. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the audience itself. As personnel filed out of the auditorium, conversations continued in hallways and parking lots, with medical professionals discussing how they could apply Jade's principles to their own practice. Young corpsmen talked about the importance of mastering basic skills. Experienced doctors reflected on the value of maintaining proficiency in emergency procedures. Nurses discussed the psychology of remaining calm under pressure. Later that evening, as Jade returned to her quarters at the Naval Medical Center, she received a message that brought her story full circle. It was from Mrs. Chun, the mother of hospital corpsman Lisa Chun, whose misidentified remains had initially been reported as Jade's death. "Chief Reeves," the message read, "thank you for ensuring that Lisa's sacrifice was recognized and honored. Knowing that her death wasn't forgotten, and that her name is now part of the medical facility at Firebase Crimson, brings comfort to our family. You honored her memory by continuing to serve others, even when the world thought you were dead." The message continued with words that captured the deeper meaning of Jade's story. "Lisa joined the Navy to serve others, just like you did. Her death was tragic, but seeing how you've used your experience to train others and save more lives shows that her sacrifice contributes to something larger than any individual story." As Jade reflected on the day's events, she understood that her story had become something beyond personal recognition or individual achievement. It had become a reminder that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary actions when they're properly prepared, deeply committed, and focused on serving others rather than serving themselves. The woman who'd been written off as a casualty, who'd been officially declared dead while saving 2 fellow warriors, had proven that true heroism isn't about seeking recognition. It's about being ready when readiness matters, acting decisively when action is required, and continuing to serve others long after the immediate crisis has passed. Her story reminds us that every day, in professions far beyond the military, ordinary people make extraordinary contributions to the safety and well-being of others. Teachers who refuse to give up on struggling students, first responders who risk their lives for strangers, healthcare workers who provide comfort during humanity's darkest moments, engineers who design systems that protect thousands of people they'll never meet. Excellence in service isn't reserved for special occasions or crisis situations. It's a daily choice to prepare thoroughly, act professionally, and prioritize others' well-being over personal convenience. Have you ever been written off, underestimated, or overlooked by people who didn't understand your true capabilities? Share this story with someone who needs to remember that recognition isn't required for service to matter. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they're committed to serving others. And drop a comment telling us about a time when someone's quiet competence made a difference in your life. Because somewhere, today, someone is preparing for a moment that will test everything they've learned. Someone is practicing skills they hope they'll never need to use. Someone is choosing excellence over mediocrity because they understand that other people's lives may depend on their readiness. Their stories matter too. And they're being written right now, one moment of dedicated service at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.